Carlson absent. Brody Weber.
Here.
Tom Duden.
Here.
One more absent. And Sandra Washington absent.
Alrighty. Now that we have called the roll, the next item is a presentation. Oh, and this is a Opens Meeting Act. The Opens Meeting Act is posted in the back of the room, and we will adhere to the Opens Meeting Act. Now that that has been noted, thank you, Councilman Beckius, for that. The next item is the Lincoln City Council pre-council session for the 2025 LES budget amendment and revised rate schedule. So I'll pass that off to Lincoln Electric System.
Okay. Is volume and everything okay?
A little bit of
Echo. Got a bit of
Okay.
Echo. Try again.
No,
Still a little echo.
Where those monitors coming out?
Oh, like maybe there's a microphone here.
Turntables on, am I?
You can't even whisper around here.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, who's gonna fix it?
Okay.
Perfect.
Kick it off? Okay, so thank you for having us today. My name is Jason Fortick. I'm the Vice President of the Power Supply Division at Lincoln Electric System. And then a few of my colleagues here, Emily Koenig, she's our Chief Financial Officer, and then Emeka Anyawu, he's our Chief Executive Officer. So again, appreciate the time. Thank you for setting this up for us to come share this background information with you. By way of just a little setting the stage, this material and a lot more was shared with the public and our board to gain awareness and understanding of the issues that we're facing with generation and resource adequacy. And in last month's LES Administrative Board meeting, they voted to approve both the budget changes to accomplish these generation additions and the rate changes that accompany them. And so our goal with this is to share a very high level overview of all of that information that we've shared with the board and the public over the last several months. Answer any questions that you might have. I understand this can be an open kind of a narrative Q&A type thing, so please feel free to jump in and ask questions, but ultimately gain your understanding and hopefully approval of this same budget amendment and rate changes that go along with it. So with that, I'll just jump right in. Okay. So as long as everyone can see, just by way of some background information, this is a map of the Southwest Power Pool, and I'm not sure what everybody's familiarity is with the Southwest Power Pool. A lot of times you'll hear them referred to as SPP. That came up quite a few times during events like Winter Storm Uri and other issues on the system where SPP is somehow involved. They are a regional transmission organization, and so they provide a variety of services to utilities that are members of SPP. LES happens to be a member of SPP, and so we use a lot of the services they provide, but then being a member also creates some reliance on them for regulations and policy provisions and things like that. But some of the major things that they do for us and for the industry are things like reliability coordination. And in a nutshell, you could treat that as like being an air traffic controller for the electric grid. So they're constantly out monitoring what's happening on the system, making adjustments if they see issues, making changes. Overall goal is to make sure the system stays reliable, hence the reliability coordination. They also perform a balancing authority function, and that is essentially looking at the customer consumption on the system and then the generation production on the system and keeping those two balanced, balancing authority. And that has a very big implication for keeping the system stable. You want to always keep your generation output balanced with your customer consumption. And so they look across the whole footprint, keep those two things balanced. And then another very important function they provide is management and operation of a wholesale electricity market. And so LES takes all the generation that we have, sells that generation into the market based on dispatch signals from SPP, and then all of the load or the energy that we consume for our customers or purchase for our customers for their consumption, they provide that market to do that exchange of generation production and then load consumption. So very important functions that they perform. I said we're members. We get a lot of benefit from being members of SPP, but they're a regulatory body, and so that imposes some requirements on us, and that's what we're going to talk about in these next several slides, is the changes that they have made to be a good steward of all the assets that are in the footprint and then provide reliable service. And so I mentioned just briefly Winter Storm Uri, but a lot of these things that we're going to talk about today really had their start in the events of Winter Storm Uri. Everybody remembers that from a few years ago. There were some generation issues, some outages on the system, actually some rolling outages that were implemented to try to keep the system stable. That was not pleasant for anyone in the industry, and that really started the ball rolling on SPP looking at ways to try to make the system more reliable. And there were several task forces formed, regulatory people from the different states involved in reviewing all of this stuff. End result was a whole slate of changes that they made to try to get the system to be more reliable. And the items listed on this slide here are a few of the really high profile changes that they made. First one listed up there is a process called effective load carrying capability. And this is a way of rating generation that is non-dispatchable. So think of generation like wind or solar, battery storage, things that you can't directly dispatch or turn on and off at your pleasure because you're kind of subject to what the weather is doing. This process essentially looks at how much of each of these generation types are on the footprint and reduces their amount of accredited capacity based on how much is installed in the footprint.
So you're relying on them less.
Correct.
Okay.
And I should probably cover the concept of nameplate capacity versus accredited capacity. That's kind of important for some of these. So nameplate capacity is a term we use in the industry, and it refers to the maximum output that a generator is capable of producing, and it quite literally can be a nameplate, stamped on the side of the generator. This is the most output or most energy that unit can produce. Accredited capacity, on the other hand, is usually an amount that's lower than the nameplate capacity, and it is determined by how much of that generator's output you can count on to serve load during your peak conditions. And it's that accredited capacity that we're required to provide to cover our load, plus a margin on top of that. So when you see some of the stuff in our slides about nameplate capacity versus accredited capacity, those are really important terminologies to know, because accredited capacity is the stuff that we're held to for a lot of these regulations. The next item up there, is performance-based accreditation. So this is a similar type of process, but it's for units that are dispatchable. So think of things like coal or natural gas, nuclear, hydro. This process looks at your generation fleet, what type of outages it took, what type of derates it took for maintenance issues, other mechanical issues, and then assigns a reduction from that nameplate value on what you can count on an accredited basis to meet your customer load requirements. So both of those things are applied to generators, and they change the amount that we get to count towards our accredited capacity requirements. And then the last item listed up there is called planning reserve margin. This is a concept that's been in place for a number of years. Currently, SPP has a planning reserve margin of 15% in place, and what that means is you have to have enough generation to cover your forecasted peaks plus another 15%. So that's been in place for a number of years, and it typically has applied to just the summer season. Well, as a result of some of these Winter Storm Uri events, they not only changed the planning reserve margin requirement for the summer, they also implemented one for the winter. So a winter reserve requirement is a new requirement for us, something we haven't had to comply with before. And then in addition to that, they changed the percentages. So starting next year, the summer percentage is going up to 16%, and then the new winter reserve margin is going up to 36%, and then it's projected to increase again in a few years up to 17% in the summer and 38% in the winter. So these are all new things for us, which leads to the last line on here. When you look at all these regulations that have changed and the time frame that they're putting them in, it's taking our generating fleet and reducing the amount of it that we get to count for accredited capacity. This is happening to all of the members in the footprint that have generation and load requirements. And the end result is that we will need to do something to gain back or increase the amount of accredited capacity to meet our load requirements plus planning reserves.
You had mentioned members that have generation and load requirements. Are there members that do not have generation and load requirements?
There are generator-only members.
Okay.
So if they are selling their generation to another entity that has a load responsibility requirement, that load responsibility entity is probably,
Okay.
getting together with them to make sure to.
Okay, so basically like a subcontractor for generation.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but these really apply to entities that are load responsible. They're called
Okay,
LREs
got it.
in the footprint.
Okay.
So that's who they really apply to. Many, not all, but many load responsible entities also have their own generation. Some just contract for it, but if you're a load responsible entity, you need to make sure you've got enough generation to cover your forecasted peaks plus reserves.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I covered a lot of material there and some pretty in-depth concepts at a very high level. So any questions or anything before I move on? Okay, so then if we look at this next slide, I'll step through just a little bit how to read this. So it's a summer requirement and a winter requirement. So we've got summer generation capability shown on the top set of slides there, the bars, and the bottom is the winter bars. The green bars represent our resource stack, or how much generation capability we have. That orange line that you see increasing for both the summer and the winter, that's our peak load forecast plus reserve. So that's the minimum amount of generation that we need to have to be compliant with these new regulations. And then those numbers that are above each of the stacked bars, or each of the bars on the left side, that's how much excess generating capacity we had on an accredited basis. And I would say the big takeaway here is that drop from the year 2025 to 2026.
Sure.
Because those ELCC, or effective load carrying capability, the performance-based accreditation, the planning reserve margin, all those things change and take effect in 2026. And so you see the big drop that we had for 2025 to 2026. That's really what's driving this proposal to add generation to our system. And then the amounts I want to point out there. You can see in the summer we dropped a little bit over 130 megawatts of generation, and then the summer a little bit over, or in the winter a little bit over 200 megawatts of generation. And then that window on the right there, that shows how much we lost from each of those processes. And so we unfortunately had some outages at some of our generation, and the way these things are calculated, those outages landed right in the window of when they were going to start counting against us for this set of new processes. And so we need to make up some of that difference by adding generation to our system. And just to put it in perspective, there are a lot of other utilities, I'd argue almost all, probably going through this same process across the SPP footprint. We're not unique in having to do this, and if you go to SPP board meetings or follow any material, this is an ongoing discussion with almost all the utilities in the footprint of how are we going to meet these new requirements, and what are the time frames and what are the costs. So it's unfortunate that we have to do this, but we're not the only one in the footprint that's going through this process right now. Okay, so this is a very busy slide, and this again was shared with our board. I'll try to step through this so you get a little handle of what's going on here. So across the x-axis, that's years, starting with current year out to past 2040, and then each of those stacked bars is a different type of generation type. And as you can imagine, our board asked us to analyze all types of generation assets, different combinations of them, various market conditions, a whole bunch of analysis that went into this. Kind of the summary of that is we landed on about 4 different generation types that had some type of viability. One of those is combustion turbines fired by natural gas. Another one is wind. Another one is battery storage, and another one is solar. And so if you look at all those bars, the yellow bars that are the lowest on there, those represent combustion turbine additions to meet these planning reserve margin requirements. The green represents wind additions. The blue is battery storage, and then the orange is solar. And we tried to normalize them so that when you're comparing the costs of each of these, you're getting the same equivalent amount of accredited capacity from each of these. And so if you can read the fine print at the bottom there, the Aero CTs, the combustion turbines, that's adding 100 megawatts equivalent of combustion turbine. At the lowest, well, that is the cost, yeah.
Right.
But that one happens to be the lowest cost also. But then if you look at those other types, you'll see like wind, for example. Wind PPA is power purchase agreement. To get the equivalent amount of 100 megawatts of combustion turbine production and accredited capacity from wind, we had to add 400 megawatts. Same type of thing with the battery storage. You had to have more of it because of those ELCC reductions. And then solar is probably the largest, kind of the outlier on there. To get an equivalent amount of 100 megawatts of combustion turbine accredited capacity from solar, we had to add 1,100 megawatts of, to get equivalent of 100 megawatts of CT production, we had to add 1,100 megawatts of solar production into the model. So some pretty big differences in the amount of generation that you had to add. And then that's reflected in the costs. This is all net, net cost. So what's the cost for us to either build or buy these contracts, and then taking away or reducing that by the amount of market energy revenue that we get and other market products that we get. So you can see overall the lowest cost option that meets the resource reliability requirements is the combustion turbine option by a pretty large factor. And then at the request, one of our board members, we also added in a cost for CO2 mitigation, because as you know, we have the 2040 decarbonization goal. So when we get out to the year 2040, we added a CO2 mitigation cost in there to make it a level playing field between adding combustion turbines that burn natural gas to the other resource types, because they're not producing CO2. But end result, after all of that, as I can see on the charts, the combustion turbines ended up being the lowest annual cost option for us to pursue. And that is ultimately what we recommended to our board. We went over this material with them over the last several months, made a recommendation to them, which was to add 2 aeroderivative-based combustion turbines to our existing Terry Bundy generating station. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but northeast side of town, about 70th Street and Bluff Road, we have an existing generating site. And when we built that site in the early 2000s, we laid it out to be able to add more generation out there. And so the turbines that we're proposing to add at that site quite literally have slots sitting for them there to go add this generation. So it became a very cost-effective option to do this. We have the site already built, so water, fuel, emission controls, all those types of things are already out there for this installation. And then on top of that, ended up being the most cost-effective compared to the other options that we pursued. So that's what we're proposing to do, is go down the path of adding these combustion turbines. We think that this is going to be about a $180 million addition based on the estimates that we've got from the engineering firms that we've worked with. And I think I forgot to mention it, but that slide, I'll just back up. This slide where we showed the amount of excess accredited capacity that we have, if the world performs like our models show, we will be deficit by the year 2031. So when we saw that, we said we really need to start moving on this, because we think it's about a 4 to 5 year construction time frame to add this generation. So we would like to start moving forward now so that we have that time frame to purchase, contract for purchase, install, and commission, get the turbines in service by that 2030 year, so that we're ahead of our deficiency that we are projecting in 2031. Okay, again, a lot of material there. Anything?
Yeah, quick question.
Yeah.
So with the Bundy generating station, the turbines that you're adding, what does that do to that generating station? Does it put it at capacity, or is there the ability to add more turbines and/or larger turbines or more efficient turbines later on down the road? Or can you give me a sense as to the capacity of that station then?
Sure. Yeah. So when it was laid out, the whole site was graded, a lot of the infrastructure put in place to expand beyond what we currently have. And so right now there are 4 turbines sitting on the south side of the site. There are 2 more slots on the south side of the site. So these would be Unit 5 and Unit 6 on that south side. The site was built to mirror that whole arrangement to the north. So water supply to the site, natural gas supply to the site, fuel oil storage, all that is built built to take the whole thing and mirror it on the north side of the site.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, and with that, I will get to the last slide in my part of the presentation, then I'm going to turn it over to Emily to cover some of the budget and rate related stuff. So we just wanted to point out to you the recent generation additions that we've made to our resource portfolio. And they're depicted up here in the items that are highlighted and then called out by name. So we recently added a little bit over 400 megawatts of nameplate capacity from 2 wind projects, and those are tied to the relationship we have with Google and the expansion that they're making at the data center site on the north side of town. I don't know if it was Mr. Shobe, if I visited with you before the meeting, but you asked about the hydro additions that we made. So that's listed up here. It's about a 22 megawatt hydroelectric generation addition that we made beginning April 1st. We negotiated that contract, and then it went into service April 1st. So now we're receiving capacity and energy from that contract, and that facility is in the North Platte area. It's actually Brady, Nebraska, but kind of the North Platte area where we get capacity and energy from some hydro generation. We're in the process of adding a small battery storage project to our downtown microgrid. That is projected to come online late this year, hopefully like early fourth quarter time frame. And then the last thing shown up there in the blue is the 100 megawatts of combustion turbine generation that we're proposing to add. So if you look at the pie charts, in the very recent past here, all the generation that we've added equates to about 80% of that generation being from renewable resources, and that's represented by the green portion of that pie chart on the left. And then the remainder of the stuff we're going to add or proposing to add here in the near term is natural gas, so about 20%, a little less than 20% comes from that. And then if you look at what we're projecting out to 2030, the pie chart on the right side there, we think that our overall portfolio on a nameplate basis is going to be almost 50% renewable, and then about 30% natural gas, and the remaining little over 20% coming from coal resources. So that's a summary of that. If there are questions, I'll hand it over to Emily.
I don't need that.
Don't need that, okay.
Nope. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget amendment and the impact to customers and the proposed rate increase. So as Jason mentioned, the rules that have been implemented for SPP, those became known to us in August. So if you recall, I was in front of you in about November with our budget, but that process was underway in August, September with our board. So it wasn't possible for us to know exactly how those rules were going to impact us at that time. So we were aware that something was going to change. So the rate increase that we brought forward, which was 3.3% for 2025 that became effective at the beginning of the year, did have about 1% in there for kind of unknown generation needs. We knew that something was coming. We knew we needed to build in something for future infrastructure needs. That's about $3 million. So the rules became known to us in August. It took until about December timeframe for Jason's team to kind of see how they would exactly apply to our resources and make some assumptions there. Met with Emeka and I to really drill in on what it would mean for us. And then we've spent since that time, January through May, really educating our board and the community on what it means for us. So we've tried to act as quickly as we could to get here, but it has taken us a little bit of time. But that explains a little bit of why we're in this position that we are as far as a mid-year budget change. As Jason mentioned, the speed at which we need to do this to be in compliance with the rules around SPP, to have that generation available in the 2030, 2031 timeframe, the supply chain issues are real. And I think every month that we wait to get into the queue are several months on the back end and probably higher cost for us. So that's why we're in front of you. It's not what we'd like to do, but it's what we think is the prudent thing to do and probably the lowest cost option for customers, and so that's why we've chosen this approach. So just to highlight, those cash flows for both what Jason described as the Terry Bundy generating additions and the Jeffrey Hydro were not included in the 2025 budget. We had a placeholder, but not enough to cover both of those. In late April, early May, so pretty recently here, we became aware of the first kind of shot across the bow of the contract for the the Terry Bundy generation station turbines, what the cash flows for those might be. We're of course going to negotiate what's hopefully most favorable for LES customers, but they were significantly higher than what we thought for 2025, to the tune of perhaps $25 million of cash outflows in 2025 that we did not anticipate. So if that holds true, and it's not, as Jason mentioned, there's a lot of utilities in the same situation that we're in. While we will do the best that we can in this negotiation, we don't have a ton of leverage in this situation. So we have some short-term facilities that we can pull on, but not a lot. And if we drain those for this need, then we don't have reserves in place if something unforeseen or emergency situation were to arise for LES to have access to cash. So this would put us in a difficult position if we were to actually have to have this amount of outflows of cash that we weren't planning for this year. So that is why we're proposing the 4%. And so that would bring in about $6.5 million in this year. So it shores it up partially, but not all the way. I'm going to get into a little bit of the details. So Jason mentioned that the cost of the Terry Bundy additions is about $180 million. Using our best assumptions and keeping in mind our financial targets and that we need to adhere to in order to keep a AA bond rating, to keep interest rates low for LES customers. The cash required revenue requirement from customers is about $14.6 million per year. That's a 4.5% rate increase. We think there's probably some things we can do when we go to issue long-term debt as far as refinancing some of our old debt, tendering some of that, structuring the debt for optimization of principal and interest payments, so we're not asking for the full 4.5 because we think there's some things we can do there to probably lessen that. This is just kind of a straight amortization of what it would be, probably not more than 0.5% savings that we can get from those processes, but that's kind of a summary of how we get to the 4%. It's mainly for the TBGS additions. This is a history of where we've been for rate increases for LES. So you see that we had a long period of time there where we were at 0. We've had quite a few years here where we've had rate increases. The reason why I've shared this publicly and with you and our board is we're probably heading into a period where we're going to be in the range of 3 to 5% from here on out. I don't see a period of time where we're going to be at 0 again, just with the pressures that we have from adding the debt service that I just described for this and other generation additions that we may have, as well as other cost increases for the utility. We're probably in the 3 to 5% range. So just wanted to highlight that as kind of what we're thinking and take the opportunity to mention that so that there's no surprises, I guess, in that regard. I would mention at this point too, it's not our preference to go about this in this way and this quickly. We did try and be as aggressive as we could with customer communications. We've had chamber meetings. We've done a large business advisory council meeting. We actually did 2 of those because we had talked about the budget amendment and then came back and determined we needed to do the rate increase combined with that. And so we had a second meeting with them. We had a public meeting that was already scheduled, so we took that opportunity to talk about the rate increase as well. We've had some public come to our board meetings. We've taken those comments. We've shared all of that information with our board. So we would have liked to have more time, but we've done as best we can with a short amount of time that we had, I think, to try and get the message out to customers and get that information to our board as well. The sentiment has been mostly, I'd say, in 2 camps. Don't like the rate increase but understand it, or would prefer you weren't doing fossil fuel resources, but as Jason pointed out, it is the cheapest option for us at this point. And so, I think there's kind of competing things there with affordability and reliability that we have going on. So those are kind of the 2 sentiments that we have. This is a chart that's very boring, actually. It just shows the 4% for everyone. We didn't take the opportunity to do a lot of sculpting of the rates and a lot of the art that we sometimes do as far as cost of service. And because this cost is just in the generation part of the bill, it kind of applies to everybody equally. There isn't a lot of moving parts in this where there is when you have a $400 million budget. Typically we have a lot of different things that impact customers differently, but so everybody's pretty much getting on average a 4% rate change here, which is about $4 per month for an average residential customer. So just to summarize, and I think first readings today, public hearing will be next week, so we would be back in front of you with a very, very shortened version of this same material. And then on the 23rd is when we'd be seeking action from you on this, but it'll be a budget amendment of $180 million, which will add to our already $474 million budget because we've changed the capital budget to now include the entire cost of any project that starts in 25 or 26. So we'd be amending that 25 budget by the full $180 million, and then we'd be asking for a 4% rate increase to start July 1st of this year. So
if I may,
sure.
Really quickly before we go to questions, just a couple of things to maybe highlight, and I think Jason and Emily have done a great job, hopefully, of laying out kind of the particulars of the decision. This is really one of those moment in time things. I appreciate that Emily sort of made the point about what we think the future looks like in terms of our financial projections. And we're trying to bring a measure of reality here so that as we do this going forward, hopefully we can do this more in the regular way through our normal annual rate process and have the opportunity, obviously, to have that kind of dialogue. And that is, again, a moment in time based on what the economics look like right now, what supply chains look like right now. You've heard Jason make the point about the Terry Bundy station and how it is uniquely positioned for us to take advantage of some efficiencies and some risk reduction, quite frankly, in terms of executing here. And we certainly recognize that this is not an easy message to bring to the community or to bring to the council. But hopefully we've been able to kind of depict why it is important to act with some urgency and some level of kind of rapid reaction to make sure that we don't lose any time in taking action here. So appreciate the opportunity to be before you all. We can go to questions.
Terry Carlson, we did from here.
All right. Do we have any questions? Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, first of all. Appreciate it very much. Given the new requirements brought forward by the Southwest Power Pool, does LES anticipate altering its plan to address carbon goals? And does that potential alteration of a plan also inform your budget going forward as well to counteract some of the impacts that the power generation and the reliability that we're speaking of today will have going forward as well?
I'll start on that one. I think it's important to point out that up until this point, LES's decisions around resources have always been with the prudence and affordability and reliability in mind, right? So you couldn't really point to any specific things and say, well, LES only did that because of the goal, right? The goal is a target. It is not a mandate, and so the objective has always been balanced by affordability and reliability. We certainly think, and we did a bunch of work with the board on this, that one of the things that will be true is in order for that goal to remain attainable, certain things would have to happen both from a technology perspective and from an economics perspective. And if those things materialize, then there are paths that can still get us there. It certainly doesn't mean that there are any sort of drop dead sort of clauses in there. I say that in part to say, frankly, there isn't a ton of stuff that was sort of baked into our budget and needed to be taken out. I think we had thought previously, the initial IRP modeling that was done in 2020 had LES pursuing an additional renewable solar asset. That obviously is not what we're doing. We're doing something different. And so again, like I talked about at those moments in time, we'll continue to be opportunistic like we were with the hydro, with the Jeffrey Hydro addition, but we're certainly not going to allow reliability or affordability to be compromised as we try to figure out what is attainable from a carbon perspective.
Sure. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, LES had a board and a city council that approved budgeting in the past prior to the implementation of the goal, the carbon decarbonization goal that we have in front of us today. But we did have a board and a city council in the past that had not, because there was no plan, probably, put aside dollars in the future to work on these particular goals. And so I was simply wondering if, as pricing may change in the future years on power generation that does produce carbon, if it may be appropriate to not necessarily lower rates, but rather save for items that provide for less impact going forward, because we know that we don't necessarily have the dollars to make those, and obviously those are large dollar amounts as well, and we're talking about rates that really don't amount to the amount of money that you would need without bonding. But I'll just say that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
You made me think of one thing too that I forgot to mention, if it's okay. So we do have authorization to issue bonds through your approval that we seek every 2 years. We have up to 300 million. That will expire at the end of this year. So I'm not sure, based on market conditions and how quickly we can act on this and know with certainty the cost, whether we'll get it done this year. So and even if we don't, we will be back seeking that authorization because we do that every 2 years. So just so there's clarity on the financing of the turbines, it'll either be later this year or next year, but in one way or another, we'll be back seeking your approval for that too, as well as through our board. So.
Right. And then your question reminded me of something I think I neglected to mention also, which is that our board asked quite a few questions about, does this keep us on the path to meet the decarbonization goal? And we think it does. We've done a lot of modeling on how we think the market is going to dispatch these units, and we think they're not going to run a tremendous amount compared to some of the other units in the footprint, so they're not going to produce a lot of CO2. And that's why we put some of those numbers in the future years for carbon mitigation, knowing that these units do produce CO2s. There might be something we need to do to mitigate that, but we don't think it prevents us from staying on the path to meet the 2040 goal.
And maybe just to kind of augment that too, in terms of the conversation with the board, we showed the board, and it's in the public materials, a number of scenarios by which we could, sort of following this edition, ultimately meet that goal. And again, there are some of the scenarios that call for, the addition of nuclear resources or carbon capture and sequestration. We've even done scenarios that have us doing that with a combination of renewables and batteries, right? Any combination of those things that potentially could materialize. But each one of those sort of options obviously comes with its own sort of different price tag, depending on economic conditions, depending on policy conditions, depending on supply chains. And as we go forward, we will continue to reach those decision points with the board relative to your question about when and how do you begin to make financial choices around what you want to invest in next, right? And that all depends on what choices we make in terms of what we invest in.
What other questions?
Who went first?
Go ahead, Brett.
Okay, thank you, Chair Carlson. So you mentioned earlier about how there was an unanticipated amount of cash flow when it related to the generating station system. What do you attribute that large amount that was unanticipated, right? There was the placeholder. What explained or what caused this amount to be so vastly different than expected?
So for one, we didn't know exactly what we'd need to do to meet the rules. In August, when we were setting the budget, we didn't know what the rules were, essentially. I think, and Jason can speak to this too, but I think we were going about it thinking that maybe it would be about a 10% down payment, kind of typical to what it's been in the past, which has been about 20 years ago since we've done anything like this. I think we found out that we were mistaken on that because there is so much demand for these turbines that they get to decide pretty much whatever they want as far as cash flows and progress payments on if you want to sign a contract with them. So we just didn't, we haven't done this for a long time, so.
Yeah, and it wasn't until we were just getting budgetary pricing from some of the turbine manufacturers and kind of our rule of thumb for the projects that we've done, but that was a number of decades ago now, what the initial type down payment or secure your spot in the production queue would be. And that's what we used, total project cost and a percentage of that. Turns out that the percentages now that the manufacturers are expecting are a lot higher and then a lot more frequent payments than what we were used to in the past.
Yeah, I think you can infer, right? Because again, not only is it that LES has not done this in 20 years, but the reality is we're at a unique point in time, quite frankly, in global supply chains around these kind of items, where there are demand pressures that are unusual, right, in terms of the number of people who are demanding these. And so what it just means is the folks who manufacture these assets can command more aggressive payment schedules than they might otherwise be able to, simply because if you don't want to pay that, there's somebody else who would very gladly take your production slot and pay the money.
Market.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Councilman Shay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mine will be easy. Jason, you talked about, first off, this is, these are not the right words, but this is being driven by the Southwest Power Pool. They're the regulatory body. They put these rules in place. You talked about getting the new turbines online by 2031, about 6 years from now.
2030, hopefully.
2030.
Yeah.
So, what is the ask of the Southwest Power Pool, that we sign a contract that we'll get this done by 5 years from now? Or the action we're taking now, how does that satisfy their regulations?
Yeah, essentially you have to have at or above that minimum requirement each year. And if you are below that minimum requirement for reserve margin, then there's a penalty process. And so if we don't have enough, we can't demonstrate enough accredited capacity to meet our reserve margin requirements, they'll apply a penalty to us. And then you would continue to pay the penalty on an annual basis until you rectify the situation or get enough generation to meet your minimum load requirements.
So the actions we'll take in the next few weeks, will that be enough to keep us out of the penalty range?
They wouldn't apply the penalty until we actually go deficit. You know, so from their perspective, they would look at LAS and say, "You're above zero, you're good." We're looking at it going, "Yeah, but we're barely above zero, and we need time to build these things so that we don't go below zero in 2031."
That last phrase was really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, they wouldn't assess that until the year of. But what we are responsible to do is to anticipate.
We're in compliance now, we want to stay in compliance.
Correct.
Yes.
And these actions will keep us from falling out of compliance.
Correct. And like Emily mentioned, in a timely fashion, because all of the information we're receiving is that this is probably a 4 to a 5 year project to go from, signing contracts to installation and commissioning, which means if that's really accurate, we need to be starting now.
Last month.
Yeah. So
About
that
a
all
year
of,
ago.
right. So that all of our other future projections, don't show us going deficit.
Thank you, that was helpful.
Councilman.
Yeah, was there any look at hydro in conjunction with Lincoln, seeking water from Missouri, going in that direction for hydroelectric power?
No, I mean, I'm a little bit past the end of my skis on hydro projects, but I'll, make the statement that it would be very, very difficult to add any hydro generation to any of the nation's, streams or waterways. In fact, a lot of places are looking at taking out dams that are used for hydro production. So it would be great if there were options for hydro, because it checks a lot of boxes in terms of, dispatchability and CO2 mitigation. But there are just not very many hydro projects available, which is why we felt really fortunate to be able to find this one that Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation had available.
Okay. Thank you.
Certainly.
What other questions do we have? Thank you all. Appreciate it. Anything else you'd like to add, or?
The only thing I thought of, if it's okay, I don't want us to make it sound like SPP is the bad guy and
no.
they're the regular. We have, they're doing what they need to do and with their regulations and to, increase the reliability. And we have an unusually high amount of participation even at this table. We're each on a committee for SPP, and it's for the size of our utility. We have a lot of representation. We help make these rules. And so, they're not the bad guy in this. They're doing the right thing for reliability for the footprint. And so I just wanted to convey that too, if it came across that we're,
Right. And at the risk of digging down too deep into the inner workings of SPP, they have a group called the Regional State Committee, and it is made up of a representative from each of the state commissions, like Public Service or Public Utilities Commission, that they operate in. And so that group has been heavily involved in this whole process for just those very reasons. They're representing their customers, their states. They want to do things that are both helpful for the customers and reliability, but also, manage costs. And SPP, like Emily said, they're in a bit of a tough spot because they have responsibilities to keep the system stable. The only way they can do that is to create regulations that we comply with to help meet those reliability requirements. So yeah, I don't want to portray them as they're a great group of folks, and they got a lot of good policies, but they have a lot of responsibilities, and they need to do things to make sure that we're all doing our part.
Yeah, the state committee, by the way, just kind of as a matter of trivia, is also currently chaired by Board Member Chuck Hutcherson from PRB. So Nebraska has very good influence and representation in terms of how these rules are being made. And the last sort of bit of color that I'll add to those statements is, you know, everybody remembers Uri. I think most folks recognize that there is a scenario in which a Uri type event happens, and this time the impacts are not down south somewhere in Texas. The impacts are here in Nebraska, and it will be because of SPP that we would be able to keep the lights on here. So these big footprint relationships matter. They matter a lot. They do a lot for the reliability and keeping the lights on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna pray for wind and storms tonight.
Do we need a motion? Okay, we'll go ahead and close the meeting.